In this week's Technique Tuesday video, I'll demonstrate how to knit a sock heel with a contrast yarn without having to cut the main project yarn, leaving you with fewer tails to weave in later. As always, if you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, there are direct links down in the description. So there are a lot of reasons why you might choose to use a contrast yarn for the heel and other parts of the sock. One reason might be if you are concerned about running out of yarn. Another reason might be that you are using a self-striping yarn like I've used here, and you don't want to break up the striping sequence by continuing to use it for the heel. So whatever your reason, one of the issues with using a contrast yarn is that you're joining a new ball of yarn to the work, and you're going to have yarn tails for the contrast yarn. So what I'm going to show you today is how to work a contrast heel in the middle of your sock without cutting the main yarn. So here's an example of a sock where I've knit the leg and I've changed to a new color to knit the heel. And so right when I was about to start the first setup row for the heel, I cut the main yarn and I joined the contrast color. I knit the entire heel, I turned the heel, and now I'm at the point where I'm ready to resume working in the round. Now there are a couple of places where I could choose to cut the contrast yarn and rejoin the main yarn, but regardless, whether I did it here, whether I did it in the middle of the heel, which is typically where the beginning of the round is when you resume working in the round, or if I decided to work with the red all the way across here and then join the main color, regardless of that, I would have to join the main yarn at somewhere along here, and I'd have another yarn tail to weave in. So typically the start of a heel is going to include some setup rows, and they're going to be written in one of two ways. One way would be to knit across half the stitches, so all of the stitches I have here, and then to turn and then slip the first stitch and then purl my way back. And from then on, I would be working whatever the heel stitch pattern was that I was going to use for this particular sock. But other instructions might have you start at the beginning of the round, work a quarter of the way into a round, then turn and work back all of those stitches, plus work back a quarter of the way here. So you'd still be working on half of the stitches, but you would have the beginning of the round centered in the middle of the heel. So when you work that first setup row of knit stitches, regardless of whether it's just 25% of the round or 50% of the round, don't change to your contrast color yet. Continue with the main color, knitting as many stitches as your pattern calls for. So in this case, I'm going to knit across half of my stitches. So once you get to the point where you stop knitting and you turn, this is the point where you're going to join your contrast yarn. You're not going to cut the main yarn. You're going to leave it hanging there. So you're going to slip this first stitch, which is going to be the main color, and now you're going to purl the rest of the stitches across. So now you're ready to begin the actual main stitch pattern for whatever type of heel you're working, whether it's stockinette, eye of partridge, heel stitch, or something else. You've established the stitches on the needle in the contrast color, so whatever you do to these stitches from now on will be incorporated into the main heel pattern. So now I'm going to knit my heel and my heel turn, and then I'll show you what to do next. So now I'm at the point in this sock where I left off in this sock. I have finished the heel, I've done the heel turn, and the contrast yarn is hanging at this edge of the heel. The difference between these two heels at this point is that this heel has a row of knit stitches in red before you start seeing the slip stitches. And that's because I had cut the main yarn at this edge, joined the contrast yarn, knit across, and then purled across, and then began my slip stitch pattern. Where with this heel, I worked the knit row all the way across using the main yarn. Then I joined the contrast yarn and purled the first row. So in this heel, the contrast yarn begins with those slip stitches rather than having that initial row of red. So typically, when you have finished turning the heel, you work halfway across the heel stitches and you mark this as the beginning of the round. And we're still going to do that, but we're not changing the yarn color at this time. So I've knit across all of the heel stitches with the contrast yarn. Again, the beginning of the round is here. I could put a marker there if I wanted to remind myself. And at this point, you need to pick up stitches along the first heel flap edge. Still, we are not going to change the yarn color. So I pick up along the edge of the flap with the contrast yarn. I always pick up a couple of stitches in the corner, so I'm going to use the contrast yarn for that technique as well. And now I'm going to switch to working with the main yarn. And now when I get to this edge, I'm going to pick up these stitches using the main color yarn. So now that I have picked up all of the stitches, you'll see I have the two contrast yarn tails. They're at the same location because I started and stopped the contrast yarn at the same location. And that means I don't have any yarn tails made up of the main color that are dangling that need to be worked. So if you look very closely with this yarn, you can see that I picked up with the contrast color yarn along the edge of this flap. And you can see those tiny little light green stitches, and then you'll see the stripe when I began working with the self-striping yarn. Where on this side of the heel, I don't have that little stripe. But I would guess that when you look at it from this perspective, you cannot tell the difference. This technique of waiting to join the contrast yarn until you work your first purl row can also be used with short row heels. Knit the first short row with the main yarn and switch to the contrast yarn after you've made your first turn. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.